How the people, how you doing? So, today we have the complete comparison between the Mi 11 Ultra and the S21 Ultra. Now you may have heard this already, but I first heard this quote back when I was watching the Mi 11 Ultra's review from Mr. Who's the Boss, and there he stated that the Mi 11 Ultra is essentially Xiaomi's take on the S21 Ultra. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at how the Mi 11 Ultra really takes on the S21 Ultra, it's very obvious. This is definitely an Ultra phone made to compete with Samsung's Ultra phone from Xiaomi. But as you may have also heard at this point, that specs and numbers don't really say the whole story. So upon using the Mi 11 Ultra across a few months now, I think there are some key differences between the S21 and the Mi 11 that one should know before they purchase it so that they can make the right decision. Now, one thing you should also keep in mind is that there is a price disparity going on for the Mi 11 Ultra. Essentially, what I found is that it is more expensive in certain regions in Europe compared to in India, where it's actually 50% less expensive, coming in at 70,000 rupees compared to the S21 Ultra. So that is definitely a pretty big factor to keep in mind, because the S21 requires a good bit more cash, in India at least. But anyways, disregarding that, let's just jump into the design and see for ourselves how good these phones really are. So upon first glance, the very first thought that crossed my mind when I just held these two phones together was that they have quite similar design philosophies. Essentially, both are going for the slightly bold camera module look. The S21 is taking that route, while the Mi 11 Ultra is thriving there. Quite obviously, it has such a huge camera module that, in fact, it has zero table wobble compared to the S21 Ultra, which has a good bit of wobble. So, if you really think about it, the twisted logic here is that if you go big enough, you might actually solve a few problems. But anyways, essentially, upon first glance, you're gonna actually think that the Mi 11 Ultra is better in terms of design, because they're using ceramic here instead of the glass that's being used on the S21 Ultra. Now that has some advantages. We have more scratch resistance on the Mi 11 Ultra, but that's about where it stops, because I do realize that for some people the extra weight the ceramic can add can be quite problematic, and it's quite obvious when you hold these two devices. The S21 is noticeably lighter, and although I actually like the weight on the Mi 11 Ultra for some unknown reason, but I just like the density, what can I say? But the S21 is definitely much easier to use. That fact is quite obvious, and when you use these two phones, you're gonna feel a lot of hand fatigue going on the Mi 11 Ultra, while the S21, it's not even close to a problem, even though both are quite huge devices. But I do realize that weight of a smartphone can be kind of based on preference, so not gonna pass any real judgment on that. Instead, I should talk about the fingerprints, which is present quite a bit on the Mi 11 Ultra. Like, you hold this phone, you're not gonna get it clean. That's something you're gonna have to get used to. Even the white version of the Mi 11 Ultra gets its own share of fingerprints and grease, and it gets all smudgy and it feels nasty after a good bit of time, and you're gonna have to clean it up, and then promptly it's gonna get fingerprints again. That's just been my experience so far. You can obviously slap a skin on, but having matte glass, especially the S21's Phantom Black finish here, I think that quite easily one-ups the Mi 11 Ultra here. And as much as I like the weight of the Mi 11 Ultra, if I had to pick one design, I'd go with the S21. Not just because of the matte glass, because there is another small reason. If you look at the front of these two devices, you'll notice that the Mi 11 Ultra has thicker corners compared to the S21 Ultra, which has everything evened out. Now, the Mi 11's glass essentially curves over on both the top and the bottom of the device, along with the sides, which, sort of reduces the bezels on the top and bottom, but keeps it in the corners. I'm honestly not a fan of this, and although I did get used to it, they disappear quite fast when you're looking at the content or anything like that, I still think the S21 looks better overall. So yes, design, my pick is gonna be the S21 Ultra, and yeah, if you're willing to deal with the fingerprints, or if you are sure that you're gonna put on a case or a skin, then I think the Mi 11 is gonna be good. Anyways, let's talk about the display, because this is where things are a good bit interesting. Now, I'll say this right off the bat, the Mi 11 Ultra actually comes with a better display compared to the S21 Ultra, because the Mi 11 can do everything the S21 does, whether it's 1440p at 120Hz, and HDR10 and 10 plus support, really good support at that. But it also comes with 10-bit color, 1700 nits, that is 200 nits brighter compared to the S21 Ultra, and it is noticeable definitely in broad daylight, and especially when viewing HDR content. It is quite obvious, at least to my eyes. I have seen the difference and I've felt it. And finally, we also get Dolby Vision support on the Mi 11 Ultra. Now, to some people this is gonna be a huge deal because this is essentially, I think, the only smartphone, at least to my knowledge, that has Dolby Vision among Android devices, because the iPhones are the only other devices that I know of which give us Dolby Vision. So that could be quite important to some people, and it's actually quite nice because I watch a lot of Netflix, and if you didn't know already, Netflix has basically everything in Dolby Vision if it's in HDR. So having Dolby Vision can be really nice. It's definitely better than HDR10. I think you knew that already. But anyways, yes, I do believe that the Mi 11 Ultra definitely deserves a win in display. Xiaomi definitely outdid themselves. They did a fantastic job here. Honestly, I'm a huge fan of the display on the Mi 11 Ultra. And as if that wasn't enough already, if you go to display settings and color scheme, essentially you have this crazy array of options to change your display and make it look however the hell you want. I think that is just an even bigger incentive to go for the Mi 11 Ultra if it is a fantastic display that you're really looking for. But with that said, you definitely should take speakers into account as well, because we are talking about content consumption here. Well, in that regard, I think the S21 takes the win, because both of these phones sound amazing, and I would go so far as to say that when the Mi 11 Ultra speakers work properly, stressing on working properly, well then it might actually outperform the S21 Ultra. The big problem on the Mi 11 is that it's not consistent. Like, I've never really seen inconsistent speakers, but that's just how it is, you know. I've seen that in some apps like Netflix and even in YouTube, the speakers on the Mi 11 Ultra work insanely well. They're loud, they're very clear, like the clarity is quite something. It's definitely on par with the S21 Ultra, but in something like Disney Plus or Amazon Prime as well, I've noticed that the speakers on the Mi 11 are lackluster, to say the very least. You know, they're not very loud, not very clear because of that, and I'm not sure why this is the case. But display is still just a huge win on the Mi 11 Ultra. Speaking of wins, here's another place where the Mi 11 Ultra takes a good upper hand. In some cases, not all the time, because on the S21 Ultra we get two chipsets. One of them comes with the Exynos 2100, which is a great chipset. Trust me, this time around Samsung did a much better job compared to what we had last year with the Exynos 990. We do not have nearly as much issue with this year's chipsets. But that said, it's still not quite as good as the Snapdragon 888 that we have on the Mi 11 Ultra here. Now, the reason why I said in some cases is because if you can get the Snapdragon 888 version, then you're set. You don't have to worry about performance between these devices. It's going to be essentially exactly the same, right? But if you use the Exynos 2100, well then just keep in mind that the overall chipset efficiency, as in just how long this chipset, the Exynos 2100, can sustain peak performance, is going to be a good bit shorter compared to the Snapdragon 888. That only applies to the heaviest of games at the highest graphics settings. If you are such a gamer, then the Mi 11 is going to be a better choice. Otherwise, you know, the S21's chipset is not bad. It can handle heavy photo editing for fairly long sessions, to the point that it didn't really cause me any issues. And I use the cameras a lot as well, and even then it works really well. There is some heat that's going on, obviously, and it happens on both, to be honest, but you know, even so, if you're buying a flagship, it's probably going to be for a few years, and future-proofing is something that is definitely better on the Mi 11 Ultra because it uses Snapdragon. And secondly, for battery life, well, this is where both of these are tied, because firstly, their capacities are the same, and because of the fact that the Exynos 2100 doesn't have any battery issues like last year, we get just as good battery life, clocking it at around 6 to 6.5 hours. And it's the same case on the Mi 11 Ultra as well. I've gotten 6 to 6.5 hours almost similarly. When I use the camera app, there's some kind of background processing, or maybe it's the photo processing that's going on, that really causes the Mi 11 Ultra to drain a lot of battery, so just keep that in mind. Now, speaking of cameras, by the way, I think this is where it gets really interesting. Because if you think about it, we actually have a really nice high-res and actually a bigger sensor than the S21 Ultra's 108 megapixel sensor. I'm talking about the main camera, of course. This one comes in at 50 megapixels, but it is larger. And that can be quite helpful at numerous cases, and focusing is not quite that much of an issue in photographs. In videos it's a different story, I'll get to that in a moment, but in photos it's overall really nice. Now the main camera shots are actually quite similar, to the point that I don't really find either to be particularly better than the other in good daylight, but I'm pretty sure you're gonna look at the spec sheet and feel like the ultra-wide camera on the Mi 11 Ultra is gonna take a huge upper hand because it's a larger 48 megapixel sensor compared to a 12 megapixel one. It's not all that great, especially when you compare it to what we have on the Mi 11 Ultra. But that's not the entire story. Now this is where, the fact that numbers don't tell everything really comes into play, because what happens is that the Mi 11 Ultra's processing doesn't, in my opinion at least, take full advantage of what the sensor can provide. What happens is the Mi 11 Ultra's ultra-wide shots do not have any sharpening. It's just how the processing approach is, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's definitely a conscious decision from Xiaomi's part, and if you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. There's no two ways about that. That's also the case with the main camera, but it's not all that noticeable because main camera shots are in general very detailed to begin with. So you do end up noticing the lack of sharpness on the Mi 11 Ultra on the ultra wide more than anything else. Even with high-res shots, the case is the same. Speaking of high-res, by the way, the S21 Ultra has incredible dynamic range when it comes to high-res shots, especially from the main camera, because that's the only high-res sensor we have here. Because the 108 megapixel sensor on the S21 Ultra here, it actually does a much better job in controlling highlights and overall dynamic range compared to the Mi 11 Ultra, in addition to giving us more detail because it's basically double the resolution. It's kind of weird if you think about it. Like, there are certain upsides on the S21 compared to some others on the Mi 11, and there is of course the difference in processing with the sharpness, but generally speaking it's gonna be a difficult choice for anyone, to be honest. Now versatility, well, that is definitely better on the S21 Ultra here. It has both 3 and 10 times zoom, while the Mi 11 does have a really high quality 5 times optical zoom with a 48 megapixel sensor once again, but it's just 5 times, so you don't get the extended zoom range with the 10 times here. But then for portraits, well, I've seen that the Mi 11 can do a good job sometimes, but other times it tends to be kind of inconsistent, because when I compared this phone to the S21, it blew out highlights, while in the previous comparison, it didn't. I'm not exactly sure how well it's gonna turn out for you, but definitely keep in mind that the Mi 11 is a little bit more inconsistent with portraits and human subjects as a whole, especially with highlights on my face, at least. That's been the case for me. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that you can take rear camera selfies and also ultra-wide selfies on the Mi 11 Ultra using that tiny rear display? It's difficult to frame, but you can definitely get probably some of the best, if not the best, group selfie, among all the major flagships out right now. But the interesting and the quite ironical part is that selfie video is a good bit better on the S21 compared to the Mi 11, so the dilemma's real. So photography is a close call, to be honest, and in general I feel like if you like the look of the Mi 11 Ultra, then the Mi 11 is a great choice. But if you want sharpness, then I'd still say the S21 is better. But the ultra-wide camera, again, it's a weird story with the lack of sharpening, but I'd still say the ultra-wide on the Mi 11 is gonna serve you better if that is the one sensor you're really interested in, because the ultra-wide not only has a higher resolution, it actually has a larger size, so night shots turn out to be better. But then for videos, well, this is where I think the S21 takes a lead, because it's just more consistent. In some cases it has better stabilization, and it just has better focusing. That's a big deal in my opinion, because when I used the S21 and the Mi 11 for the backlit test I do with Valentine, the S21 did a much better job. The Mi 11 just couldn't focus. The dynamic range was not the issue there, the focusing was. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If you have, some fast moving pet or subject like that, then definitely the S21 is gonna be a no-brainer choice here. But if not, and I don't know, if you like landscape videography or something like that, well, then I would say that the Mi 11 is definitely a good choice. But 8K video is without question better on the Mi 11 Ultra. We can use both the main and the ultra wide camera, and the stabilization we get with the main camera as well as the ultra wide is incredible on the Mi 11 Ultra, no question about it. Compared to the S21 here, it's definitely better. But you remember that lack of sharpening in the ultra wide camera? That actually applies to videos as well, so you're gonna get technically softer video on the Mi 11 Ultra compared to the S21 Ultra. So once again, keep that in mind. It's definitely a stylistic choice. It's a look that some people really like, others don't. I know for a fact that I kind of like the sharpening on the S21, even though in some situations I've actually preferred how clean the Mi 11 Ultra can look. It goes a little back and forth in my case. That's just been how it is. Now I'm not sure how it's gonna go for you, so you're just gonna have to choose for yourself which look you prefer between these two cameras. So with that said, well, I guess that's about the end of the video. You know, we covered everything other than the software, of course. Now I do realize software can be highly preference based, so I don't really have much to say here. I personally like One UI more. I feel like it's a bit more, you know, overall better compared to the Mi 11 Ultra's MIUI 12, which is amazing. It looks and feels great, no question about it, but I just like the one-handed mode and, you know, some of the customization options that we get on the S21 Ultra a little bit more. You know, both of these phones have great UIs, no question about it, but if I had to pick one, my choice would be the One UI. So with that said, I think my choice would probably be the S21 Ultra. Even though it is more expensive, at least in terms of launch prices, I feel like the S21 is a more well-rounded flagship. You know, I think my reasons would be the speaker consistency, the cameras, the sharpening in the cameras, which I personally like a lot, and the focusing in videos. Those are my major reasons as to why I pick the S21 Ultra, because performance is obviously not an issue for me on the S21, and in general, the Mi 11's good. But goddamn, I'm just tired of these fingerprints, you know. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, do hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.